Inside Visual Studio, I created a new MVC application just using the starter template it provides. In this lesson, we want to look at a few examples of the routing concepts we've been discussing. At the top of our solution, you'll find this folder called App Start. If we expand it, we'll find a couple different classes. We want to click on the one called Route Config. This class provides the default route used by MVC, which we looked at previously. You can register multiple routes, but a powerful template like this will often meet most of your needs. This route defines a URL structure with 3 segments, which correspond to the controller, action, and an ID for some type of item we're working with. Also notice how this route defines a few defaults for the controller and action values in case those segments are excluded from the URL. Now, this register routes method as a whole is really important to our application. These routes are registered with our app on startup, which we can see if we head over to the global.asax file. Inside of this class, we have the application start method, which calls our register routes method when the app starts up. This is the very first event in the ASP.NET application lifecycle, so we know our routes will be available from the very beginning. Let's go ahead and run our application and just see what we're working with at the moment. After our application loads, we'll see this basic starter template in the browser. This view was actually generated by our home controller. Let's jump back over to Visual Studio and explore that class. Right away you can see that we have a few different action methods on this controller. Each of these corresponds to a different page on our site and returns an appropriate view. This means our single controller is handling 3 pages right now. This is very different from our Web Forms app, which has a page for every individual URL. This index view is what served up our home page, but how did this happen? Our URL on the page didn't have any controller or action segments. Well, let's place a breakpoint inside of this method and take a closer look at what's going on with our routing. I'll move back over to our home page and hit refresh, and we should land on that breakpoint. Let's open our watch window and use the debugging tools to see what's going on. I'm just going to type route data into a line in our watch window, and let's see what that gives us. If we expand that object, you can see that it has a property called values. If we expand this again, we get a set of key value pairs, and if we drill further into each of those, you can see the concepts we discussed in the slides at work. We have 2 entries for our controller and action that were populated by our route variables with corresponding values of home and index. Although our URL didn't include them directly, the route that it was matched to listed those as default values, so they have been supplied in its place. These values will ultimately be used by internal components in MVC called the controller factory and the action invoker. Together, these classes will create the controller and execute the appropriate action method. Remember, the MVC HTTP handler is what begins this process after all of these route values are in place. Let's place a breakpoint inside another one of these methods and then hit continue. Next, let's jump back over to our browser and just change the URL to another page. So we can type localhost/home/about and then hit enter. Back in Visual Studio, if we again navigate to our route data, we can expand those same objects to see that we now have the values of home and about inside our controller and action variables. The home controller was generated to handle this response, and the about method was selected to execute as the best match. Also take note of how these 2 actions are calling this return view method. This is another good example of MVC naming conventions at work. If you simply call this method without passing any parameters, it will assume you want to return a view with the same name as the action. Over on the right, if we expand our views, you can see that they're organized into directories that correspond to the controller names. MVC will automatically search for a view with the same name as the action in a folder with the same name as the controller. So hopefully this gives you a general idea of how requests work by convention in MVC. In the next lesson, let's start to build out our own controller methods to handle the pages of our application.